I'm Beth Sinclair, and the year I turned 26, my own mother told me to stop being her problem. My husband had been dead 11 days. I stood on her porch with two 1-year-olds asleep in the back of the car, asking for 3 weeks and a couch. And she looked at me the way you look at a bill you didn't expect. I'll tell you exactly what she said. But first, I want you to hold her face in your mind, because 8 years later that same face would freeze on my land, in front of 300 people, waiting for a check that was never coming. None of them saw it coming. Not my mother, not my father, not my brother. They thought the story ended the night the porch light went dark. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people meet impossible family, and the quiet ones learn the loudest lessons. If betrayal, gratitude, and slow burn justice are your thing, you're in the right place. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. This one begins in the cold, and it ends with $100 million and a single sentence that emptied a room. Let me take you back to that porch. Daniel died on a Tuesday in October, pinned under a tractor that rolled on a slope he'd graded 100 times. He was 28. I was 26. And our twins, Caleb and Hannah, had just learned to clap. The hospital called at 4:11 in the afternoon. I remember the time because I was warming bottles, and the microwave still had 11 seconds on the clock when I picked up. They asked if I could come. They didn't say why on the phone. They never do. I drove 40 minutes with my hands at 10 and 2 and my mind perfectly, terribly blank. I signed 3 forms at a counter and my signature came out steady, which felt like a betrayal of its own. A nurse asked if there was someone I could call. I said yes. I lied. The truth was I had a lease ending in 19 days, $400 in checking, and a life insurance policy Daniel kept meaning to set up and never did. We were ranch poor and young and sure we had time. People our age always think they have time. That night, I sat on the kitchen floor between 2 cribs and did the math out loud, because saying numbers kept me from saying anything worse. Rent, daycare, the truck payment, diapers in 2 sizes. I counted it twice and got the same answer both times, which was no. I had exactly 2 doors left to knock on, and I'd already decided which one I'd try first. It was the wrong one. I'd find that out by morning. My parents lived 90 minutes east, in a brick house with a wreath on the door for every season. I'd grown up there being useful. My younger brother Travis got the soccer fees and the new cleats. I got the part-time job and the speech about responsibility. I told myself that made me the strong one. I drove there with the twins because I had nowhere else, and I knocked. And my mother, Linda, opened the door in her good cardigan and did not step aside. I asked for 3 weeks, a couch, a corner, anything, just until the insurance question sorted itself out and I could breathe. My father, Gary, hovered in the hall behind her and looked at his shoes. Travis cracked his bedroom door, saw it was me, and shut it again. My mother folded her arms across that cardigan and told me the family was stretched thin, that 2 babies was a lot to take on, that I was an adult now and adults handle their own messes. Then she said the thing I would carry for 8 years. We can't be your safety net, Bethany. The babies stirred in the car. The porch light buzzed. I said, okay, because what else do you say? And I carried 2 car seats back down the steps while my mother watched from behind the screen door, and somewhere between the second step and the truck the light clicked off, like even the house was done with me. I didn't cry until the county line. Then I called the only other number I had. I called Ruth Sinclair, Daniel's mother, only to tell her I was struggling. That was all. I didn't ask for a thing, because asking had just cost me the last of something I couldn't name. Ruth listened for maybe 20 seconds. Then she said, "Where are you right now?" And I told her the gas station off Route 9, and she said, "Don't move." 40 minutes later, Walt Sinclair's truck pulled in beside mine, headlights washing over 2 sleeping babies, and the old man got out without a word and started transferring car seats, like he'd done it 1,000 times. Ruth came around the passenger side carrying a blue quilt stitched with white stars, the one she'd made when the twins were born, and she wrapped Caleb and then Hannah in it, right there under the fluorescent lights. Then she pressed something warm into my hands. It was a chipped casserole dish the color of a marigold, foil over the top, still hot, like she'd grabbed it straight off the stove on her way out the door. I started to say I couldn't. I didn't want to be a burden, and Ruth cut me off the way only a kind woman can, gently and completely. She looked at Walt and said, "Set 2 more plates, they're ours now." That was it. No conditions, no speech about adults handling their messes. 7 words in a gas station parking lot. I followed their taillights 40 miles out to a struggling little horse operation in Cedar Hollow, Texas, and I didn't know it yet, but I'd just met my real family for the first time. The Sinclair place was 80 acres of good intentions and bad luck. A barn that needed a roof, a fence line that needed everything, and a mortgage Walt didn't talk about in front of company. They put the twins in Daniel's old room and me across the hall, and for the first week I mostly stared at the ceiling and listened to horses move in the dark. Here's the part nobody at my mother's house ever bothered to learn about me. I had a degree in equine science, earned over 6 years of night classes and double shifts at a vet clinic, paid for entirely by me. I knew bloodlines, I knew conformation, I knew the difference between a horse that was sound and a horse that just hadn't broken down yet. So on day 9, when Walt walked me out to show me the stock, I stopped cold at a stall in the back. There was a bay mare in there, 4 years old, with a left front leg that turned in just slightly at the knee. Walt said she was going to the sale Saturday, that nobody wanted a crooked-legged mare, that he couldn't afford to feed what he couldn't sell. I stood at that stall for a long time. Everyone who'd looked at her had seen a cull. I watched her move 3 steps across the straw and saw something else entirely, the way that turned-in leg let her load and push off a hair faster than a straight-legged horse ever could. I asked Walt to give me until spring. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Then he looked at the mare. Then he nodded. Her name was Juniper. She was the first thing I'd chosen in 11 days. I want to be honest about who I was back then, because it isn't a flattering picture, and I'm done pretending otherwise. I was not brave. I was terrified. And I turned that terror into work, because work was the one language I trusted. I took every odd job within driving distance. I broke colts for neighbors at dawn, drove a feed route midday, and came home to muck stalls and read genetics papers until my eyes crossed. Walt offered me a wage from the operation and I refused it for 4 months, because owing the Sinclairs anything felt like a debt I couldn't survive defaulting on twice. Ruth started leaving plates outside my door because I'd stopped sitting at the table. One night Walt found me asleep standing up in the wash rack, hose still running, and he turned the water off and said quietly, "Beth, nobody's keeping score out here." I didn't believe him. I'd spent my whole life believing love came with an invoice attached, and you couldn't unlearn that in a season. The bank had given the Sinclairs 18 months before they'd start the foreclosure conversation. I knew that number the way I knew my own pulse. So I slept 4 hours and got up and did it again. And I called that strength, and I told myself the twins were lucky to have a mother who never quit. It took me years to understand that working yourself to the bone isn't always discipline. Sometimes it's just fear wearing a nicer coat. But fear, pointed the right way, can build a thing. And I had a crooked-legged mare and a barn full of nothing, and I was about to find out exactly what it could build. It took 14 months to bring Juniper along. I didn't fight that leg. I built around it, conditioning her to use what she had instead of apologizing for it. By the following spring, she could stop on a dime and roll back faster than horses worth 10 times what she'd have brought at that Saturday sale. I entered her in a small reigning futurity 2 counties over, the kind with folding chairs and a concession stand that only sold hot dogs and coffee. I didn't expect anything. I just needed proof. For the bank, and for myself. Juniper drew an early slot, and when she ran her pattern, that turned-in leg let her sink into the ground on her stops like she was pouring herself into it. We placed 3rd out of 41. 3rd. I stood in the dirt holding a green ribbon worth maybe nothing, and I felt the first solid thing under my feet in over a year. But here's the part that mattered more than the ribbon. An older woman in the 2nd row of the bleachers had been writing in a leather notebook the whole time, and when Juniper made her final stop, the woman stopped writing and just watched. After, she found me at the trailer and asked one question. "Where did you get that mare's bloodline?" I told her I'd built it from a horse headed to slaughter. She studied me for a moment, the way Walt had studied Juniper, and then she handed me a card and said she'd be in touch. The card said Vivian Hargrove. I had no idea who she was. I'd find out, and it would change the size of everything I thought I was allowed to want. My parents called twice a year, like clockwork, like a subscription nobody could cancel. That December, the phone rang on Christmas morning while the twins were tearing into secondhand gifts Ruth had wrapped in newspaper and ribbon. It was my mother. The call lasted 4 minutes. She spent the first 3 on Travis, his new venture, a fitness franchise that was going to be huge, how proud they were, how he'd always had vision. Then she remembered I was on the line and asked how I was getting along out there at the in-laws. I said the kids were healthy, and I'd placed a horse at a futurity. There was a pause, the kind that tells you the person on the other end is checking the time. Then she said, "Well, that's nice," and asked if the twins were, and here is the thing I have never forgotten. She could not come up with their names. Not one. She said the babies. My children were almost 2, and my own mother called them the babies because she had never once asked. I said Caleb and Hannah like a correction, and she said, of course, and Travis needs the phone, happy holidays," and the line went dead. I stood in the doorway watching Hannah put a bow on Caleb's head while Ruth laughed from the kitchen, and I understood something with a clarity that didn't even hurt anymore. My parents remembered me exactly twice a year, and they had never once asked the names of the only grandchildren they had. I hung up and went to set the table, and I added 2 extra plates without being asked, because in that house, that was just what you did. Vivian Hargrove was not, it turned out, a nice older lady who liked horses. She was a name. 40 years in performance horse breeding, a reputation that opened gates from Texas to Kentucky, and a portfolio she'd built and then mostly sold off when her husband passed. She showed up at the Sinclair place that February in a truck worth more than the barn, walked the fence line with Walt, and then asked to see Juniper move. She watched for 10 full minutes without speaking. Then she turned to me and said, "You read that leg correctly," which most people with letters after their name would have missed, "and I want to know what else you can see." I told her the truth, that I thought Juniper's line could throw a whole generation of horses that ran the way she did, that the trait was heritable, and the market would pay for it if I could prove it across foals. Vivian asked how much capital it would take to find out. I'd run the numbers 100 times in the dark, so I gave her the figure without flinching. She didn't flinch either. She said she'd seen a lot of talent buried under a lot of bad luck, and she had no patience left for watching it stay buried. Then she said the words I'd been bracing against my whole life. "Let me invest in you." And the strange thing, the thing I'm not proud of, is that my first instinct was no, because I'd learned what people meant when they offered to help. I'd learned it on a porch in October. So I didn't say yes. I said I'd need to see the terms in writing, every line of them, and Vivian Hargrove smiled like I'd just passed a test. I hired a lawyer with money I didn't have, a careful woman named Pat, who charged me in installments and earned every dollar. We spent 3 weeks on the agreement with Vivian, and I read every clause twice, out loud, until the language stopped being a foreign country. Vivian would fund the breeding program. In return, she'd hold a minority stake, clearly defined, with a clean buyout path if either of us ever wanted out. But the part I dug in on, the part Pat said most people in my position never think to protect, was the bloodline itself. The genetics, the breeding rights, the records, the future of Juniper's line, all of that I kept structured separately and entirely under my control. Vivian could have argued. A lot of investors would have. Instead, she read my red lines, looked up over her glasses, and said, "You're going to do just fine, aren't you?" I didn't fully understand yet why it mattered so much to me to own the thing itself and not just a share of the money it made. I think part of me was still standing on that porch, still hearing my mother price me out. I'd decided, somewhere down deep, that I would never again be in a position where someone else held the paper that decided my life. I learned something young that I've never had to unlearn. The people who love you sign clearly, the people who use you sign in fog. Vivian signed clearly, in blue ink, on a Tuesday. I signed under her. And when Pat slid the executed copies into a folder, I felt a click somewhere in my chest, the sound of a foundation setting. I didn't know it then, but I had just built the wall my whole family would one day break against. The first juniper foal hit the ground in the spring, a leggy bay colt who stood up wrong and then moved right. And I knew within a week. He had it. That low, loading hindquarter. That hunger to stop. We named the program after the creek that ran the back of the property, and I bred carefully. 3 mares the first year, then 6, matching Juniper's line to outside blood that complemented the trait instead of canceling it. By the time that first colt was a 2-year-old, I had buyers calling who'd never returned my texts before. He sold at auction for a number that made Walt sit down on an overturned bucket and stay there a while. The money started, slow at first and then not slow. We fixed the barn roof. We paid the bank ahead of schedule, and the foreclosure conversation that had lived in my chest like a second heartbeat simply stopped. And one Sunday that fall, I fed the ranch hands lunch off the back of a flatbed, ladling stew out of a chipped casserole dish the color of a marigold, the same dish Ruth had pressed into my hands at a gas station 2 years before. She caught me using it and didn't say anything, just smiled and looked away. I'd gone from the woman being fed in a parking lot to the woman doing the feeding, and I'd done it out of the same dented dish. Word spread past the county and then past the state. People started saying the name of the program before they said my name, which was exactly how I wanted it. And somewhere 90 minutes east, in a brick house with a wreath for every season, a phone was about to start ringing in the other direction. My mother called on a Thursday in March. Not Christmas, not my birthday. A regular, unremarkable Thursday, which is how I knew immediately that something had changed. Her voice was different, warmer, rounded at the edges in a way I hadn't heard since I was small and useful. She asked how I was, and then she actually waited for the answer, which she had never once done. She asked about the ranch. She used the program's name correctly, which meant she'd heard it somewhere, which meant it had traveled. She asked about Caleb and Hannah by name, and the names came out a half-second slow, like she'd practiced them in the driveway before calling. I stood in the tack room holding the phone and felt the strangest thing, not warmth, not relief, but a cold, clean alertness, the kind you get when a horse you trust suddenly pins its ears. My mother was being kind to me. After 8 years, after a porch and a dark light and the babies. I asked her, evenly, how she'd heard about the ranch. She said, "Oh, you know how people talk. Your father saw something." She didn't say what. She said, maybe I could bring the kids by sometime, that family shouldn't be strangers, that life was short. And she'd seen a thing online about a young woman in horses doing very well for herself, and it had just made her think of me. It had made her think of me. I said I'd see, and I got off the phone. And I stood in that tack room for a long while, turning one question over and over like a stone in my hand. Why now? I didn't have the answer yet. In about a month, it would arrive in my inbox by accident. Travis called next because of course he did. The fitness franchise had not been huge. It had in fact closed 2 locations and was bleeding from a third, though I only learned the specifics later. What I got that day was the charm offensive. My little brother turning it on the way he had at every family dinner of our childhood. The easy laugh, the "we've got to catch up," the "I've been meaning to call." He talked for 10 minutes before he got to it, and when he did, he rapped it so softly I almost missed the shape of it. He needed a bridge. Just a bridge. Just till the next location stabilized, and he hated to ask, but family helps family, and he'd heard I was doing real well out there with the horses. He said a number. It was not a small number. I let the quiet sit, the way I'd learned to with a green colt, not pushing, just letting the pressure speak for itself. Then I said calmly, "Travis, I help people who showed up. You weren't there." He laughed, uncertain, and asked what that was supposed to mean. I told him exactly what it meant. I told him I'd stood on Mom and Dad's porch with 2 babies and an empty checking account, and he'd opened his bedroom door, seen me, and closed it. He said he didn't remember it like that. I said I did, and I remembered it like that every single day for a year. He got quiet, then he got cold, and he said I'd always been dramatic, and family was supposed to forgive. I said forgiveness and a loan are two different transactions, and I wished him luck. And I meant it. Then I hung up and went back to the barn where things made sense. The answer to why now arrived on a Tuesday, the way these things do, dressed up as nothing. Travis forwarded me an email by mistake. He'd meant to forward it to my mother, I think, some logistics about a cousin's wedding, but his thumb caught the wrong contact, and underneath the new message sat the entire thread, scrolling back 6 years, the way email does when nobody bothers to trim it. I almost deleted it. Then a phrase caught my eye, my own name, and I scrolled. There it was, in black and white, a conversation between my mother, my father, and my brother from the spring after Daniel died. My mother had written it. She'd written that taking me in would have been throwing good money after bad, that I'd made my choices marrying a dirt-poor rancher, that some people are just a bad investment. My father had replied, agreeing, adding that they had to think about Travis's future, and then the line that hollowed me out and refilled me with something harder. My mother had written, "We keep it civil. We don't burn the bridge completely. Because you never know. If the ranch ever amounts to something, we'll want the door cracked. We'll want the door cracked." They hadn't forgotten me out of carelessness. They'd filed me away on purpose, an asset marked down, a position they'd hold in case it ever appreciated. The warm phone calls weren't a thaw. They were a quarterly review. I read it 3 times standing in the kitchen, and I waited for the wave of rage, and it didn't come. What came instead was something colder and far more useful: clarity. I printed it. I didn't print it for a lawyer or a lawsuit. I printed it so I would never again confuse what they were doing with love. I want to tell you I plotted some elaborate revenge that night. I didn't. I'm not built for schemes, and schemes have a way of curdling the people who run them. What I did instead was simpler and, I think, harder. I decided I would not give them a single hour of my anger. I would not call my mother and read the email back to her. I would not let Travis pull me into a fight he understood far better than I did. I would do the one thing my whole family had never expected me to be capable of, then or now. I would outbuild them. I would make something so solid, so cleanly and completely mine, that when the day came that they reached for it, their hands would close on air. That was the whole plan: build and structure and wait. By then, Juniper was 9 and a proven producer, the matriarch of a line that buyers across 3 states wanted a piece of, and her foals were the literal foundation of everything the program had become. I walked out to her stall that night and stood there in the dark the way I had on day 9, except now the barn had a new roof and the bank was paid, and 2 kids were asleep in a house that was warm. I scratched that crooked-legged mare under the jaw and thought about doors, the ones that close on you, the ones that open, and the ones you learn to build yourself, with hinges only you control. I wasn't going to fight my family. I'd already learned that you can't win an argument with people who keep their own books. I was going to make the books, and I was going to make them airtight, and I was going to do it quietly, starting the very next morning. You'd think people who wrote off a widow in an email thread would at least have the decency to stay away. Mine did the opposite. As the program's name got bigger, my family discovered a sudden public devotion to me. The first time I saw it, I was at a major futurity, the kind with real bleachers and a live stream, and my mother and Travis showed up uninvited, found me at the trailer, and turned into a Hallmark card the second a camera swung our way. My mother hugged me for the photographer from the regional horse magazine, her hand spread on my back like she was presenting me. Travis told a reporter, loud enough to carry, that the family had always believed in me, that they'd sacrificed so I could chase the dream. I stood there in their performance like a fence post they were leaning on for the picture, and I understood what they were building, because it was the mirror image of what I was building. I was assembling documents in a lawyer's office, quiet and unwitnessed. They were assembling a story, loud and witnessed, the story of a close family who'd stood by their girl through hard times. They were laying the groundwork to be standing right beside me when it paid off, so that no one watching would ever question why they got a piece. They dealt an image. They always had. My mother could make a room believe anything for the length of a photograph. So I let them have their photos, and I smiled the right amount, and I filed the moment away, because I'd already decided how this ended. They would build their image in public. And when the day came, I would answer it the only way that beats an image. With the truth. Out loud. In front of everyone they'd ever wanted to impress. There was one moment, just one, that nearly cracked me open. It was my father. He found me alone at the back of the trailer lot after the photos, away from my mother, and he stood there working his hat in his hands the way he did when he couldn't find a place to put himself. His eyes were red. He said, "Beth, I think about that night a lot." I waited. He said, "Your mother and I fought after you left, the worst fight of our marriage. And I sat in the truck at midnight with the keys in my hand, and I should have driven to you. I should have driven to you." For one suspended second I was 12 again, wanting so badly to believe my father would have come. Then I asked him the only question that mattered. "Dad, that was 8 years ago. Where are you standing now?" And he looked at the ground, and the silence stretched, and in that silence I got my answer more cleanly than any words could have given it. Because if he were standing with me, he'd have said so. Instead, he said something about it being complicated, about your mother, about not wanting to choose sides. He'd had 8 years and a confession halfway up his throat, and he still couldn't take one step out of her shadow. I didn't hate him. That's the strange part. I just saw him finally, all the way down, a man who felt the right thing and would never once do it. If you've ever had a parent who only loved you when you were useful, you already know the sound of that voice. Stay with me, because what happens at the ranch is the part I still can't believe I lived. Comment if this hits home, and subscribe so you don't miss how it ends. The offer came when Caleb and Hannah were 9 and I was 34. By then the program wasn't a ranch anymore. It was a brand. We had a training facility, a client list with a waiting list, and most of all we had the line. Juniper's descendants spread across the best barns in the country, every one of them tracing back to a crooked-legged mare a man had almost sent to slaughter. A Western lifestyle company, the kind that owns competitions and clothing labels and streaming shows, had been circling for a year. One afternoon their people sat across from me and Pat at my own kitchen table and slid a number across the wood. $100 million. For the land, the facility, the brand, and, they were very clear, the genetics, the breeding rights, the future of the line. I sat with that number for a moment, and I'll be honest with you, because I promised I would. It was not $100 million in a suitcase. Most of it was the value of the bloodline and the brand I'd spent 8 years building, structured over time, with part of it tied to how the line performed in the years after the sale. But the headline was real, and the headline was the kind of number that ends up in a regional magazine, then a national one. I asked for 2 weeks. They gave me 3. That night I walked out to Juniper's stall, 12 years old now and retired from the show pen to a soft paddock, and I leaned on the rail. Selling meant I would never again have to ask anyone on this earth for a place to sleep or a plate of food. Selling meant the door was finally, permanently, mine. I already knew I'd take it. The only question left was who I'd open the door for. I knew what I wanted to do with the money before I finished signing the sale, and I built it like I built everything. On paper. Airtight. With Pat at my elbow. 3 structures. The first was an irrevocable trust for Caleb and Hannah, locked so tightly that no charm, no lawsuit, no tearful Thanksgiving plea could ever pry a dollar loose. They'd be educated, secure, and free, and no one would ever stand on a porch pricing them. The second was for Walt and Ruth. The deed to the original 80 acres and the farmhouse, signed back to them free and clear, plus a funded account that would carry them comfortably for the rest of their lives, plus a real stake in the proceeds. Not a gift wrapped in obligation, just theirs. When I told Ruth, she put down the dish towel and said, "You don't owe us a thing, honey." And I said, "I know." That's exactly why. The third was the one that mattered most to me. The Daniel Sinclair Memorial Scholarship Foundation, funded for the long haul, to help young people get into equine science, with a specific preference written right into the bylaws for applicants raising children alone. I wrote that line myself. I made Pat read it back to me twice. Everything I did with documents, because documents were the only language my family couldn't argue with. They dealt in feelings and photographs and the elastic memory of who did what to whom. I dealt in signatures, witnessed and notarized and filed. By the time the sale was a month from closing, I had allocated every meaningful dollar to the people who'd shown up, and I'd done it in a form that could not be undone. I just hadn't told the people who hadn't shown up. They were about to find out the way they found out everything. From a distance, and too late. It leaked, the way $100 million anything always leaks. A regional business page ran it first, then the horse press. Then a national outlet picked up the angle they couldn't resist, the young widow who built an empire from a slaughter-bound mare. My phone, which had been quiet for years on the family front, came back to life like a thing possessed. My mother texted within 6 hours. So proud of you. Always knew. Travis sent 3 messages, then 4, the last one just a string of those celebratory little graphics, like we'd won something together. My father called and left a voicemail saying he hoped we could all sit down soon, as a family, that he loved me. I stood in the kitchen reading it all, and I heard my mother's voice from 8 years ago as clearly as if she were standing in the room. We can't be your safety net, Bethany. Except now they could see the size of the net I'd built, woven from nothing, while they watched from 90 minutes away. And every one of them was reaching for it. The woman who'd told me she couldn't spare a couch was now sliding into my texts with "so proud of you." The brother who'd shut his door was throwing me a parade through his phone. I didn't reply to any of it. Not out of cruelty, but because I'd learned that silence is its own answer, and a clear one. I had 3 weeks until the closing and the celebration I'd planned to go with it. A real event on the ranch. The horse community, the buyer's people, neighbors who'd watched me build this from a barn that needed a roof. I had not invited my family. It hadn't occurred to me that I'd need to make that explicit. I was about to learn that for some people, an invitation is optional. Travis stopped asking and started telling. The next call wasn't soft. The charm was gone, sanded down to something raw and entitled underneath, and I realized I was finally hearing my brother without the performance. He said the family deserved to be part of this. He said that. Deserved. He listed things. The way people do when they've built a ledger in their own favor and never showed it to the other party. All the sacrifices. All the ways they'd supposedly carried me. A childhood I apparently remembered wrong. Then he said the thing that told me exactly how this was going to go. He said, "Obviously we'll all be there for the announcement, and we should talk about what's fair." There was no question mark in his voice. He wasn't asking to be invited to my celebration. He was informing me that they were coming, and that a number would be discussed, and that I'd be unreasonable to suggest otherwise in front of everyone. They had spent a year building the public story of the loving family who stood by me. Now they meant to collect on it, on my land, in front of my people, where saying no would make me look like the villain. It was, I had to admit, a smart play. It was the only kind of play they knew. The leverage of a scene, the cost of looking cold. My mother had taught it to him at the dinner table for 30 years. I told Travis I'd see him at the event, which he took as a yes, and which was not a yes, and I hung up. Then I called Pat and told her to make sure every last document was signed, witnessed, and recorded before the date. Not after. Before. There would be nothing left to negotiate. I'd make sure of it. The week before the celebration, I closed every door but one. Pat and I sat at the kitchen table until the documents were a finished thing, not a plan, the trust irrevocable and funded, the deed to Walt and Ruth recorded at the county office, the foundation chartered and capitalized. I read each signature line out loud one final time, the way I'd read Vivian's contract years before, until the language stopped being words and became a wall. By Friday there was nothing left to give away. because I'd already given it to the right people, in a form that could not be reversed by tears or threats, or a scene in front of 300 witnesses. And I kept one thing for myself, the only thing the buyer agreed to carve out of the deal at my insistence. A single foal, a filly from Juniper's last cross, written into the contract as mine, retained. Not for sale at any price. She was a yearling that spring, bright bay with one white sock and a knee that turned in just slightly, exactly like her dam. And when Caleb and Hannah saw her, they argued for an hour over her name and finally agreed on June. After Juniper. The line would go on, smaller now, just ours, in a paddock the kids could see from their bedroom window. I stood at the fence the evening I finished the paperwork and watched the foundation mare and the young filly graze nose to nose, 11 years between them and the same crooked, beautiful leg, and I felt the foundation I'd been setting for 8 years finally, fully cure. Everything important was locked, everyone important was protected. All that was left was the part I'd been bracing for since a phone rang on an ordinary Thursday. They were coming, and I was ready. My mother drove out to the ranch 2 days before the event. Alone. She hadn't set foot on Sinclair land in the 8 years it took me to build it, and now she came in her good coat and stood in my drive looking at the new barn, the arena, the brass nameplate by the gate, and I watched her do the math behind her eyes, the same math she'd done on a porch in October. She started warm. She always starts warm. She told me she was proud, that she'd always known I had it in me, that a mother knows. When that didn't move me, she shifted to grief, dabbing at eyes that weren't quite wet, telling me how hard it had been to watch me struggle from afar, how she'd cried for me. When grief didn't move me either, she found the floor she was really standing on. She said, "After everything I sacrificed for you, are you really going to embarrass this family in front of the whole county?" There it was. Not love. Leverage. The threat of a scene. The cost of looking cold. The exact play Travis had run, because she'd written it first. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, quietly, that I had nothing to embarrass anyone with, that I was simply hosting a celebration for the people who'd built this place with me. She heard the shape of what I wasn't saying and her face hardened. Behind me the screen door opened and Ruth came out wordlessly and stood at my shoulder, and without a sound she lifted the blue star quilt off the porch swing and laid it around my shoulders against the evening cold, the way she'd wrapped my babies in a gas station 8 years before. My mother looked at that quilt for a long moment, then she got in her car and left. The night before the celebration was clear and cool, and I couldn't sleep, so I did what I always did when I couldn't sleep. I went to the barn. The grounds were ready. A tent up by the arena, chairs in rows, a small wooden stage where I'd say a few words, and the foundation banner would unfurl. I'd invited the people who mattered. Vivian, who'd flown in, the ranch hands and their families, neighbors who'd hauled water during the dry year and never sent a bill. The buyers' representatives, Walt and Ruth, as guests of honor, seated front and center, though Ruth had grumbled that she didn't need a fuss. I had not invited my parents or my brother. I'd thought about it the way you think about whether to leave a gate open, and I'd decided, no. This day belonged to the people who'd shown up, and there was no seat in that arrangement for the people who hadn't. I sat on an overturned bucket in the dark, the same kind Walt had sat on the day the first foal sold, and I ran my words over in my head one more time. I knew exactly what I wanted to say, and I knew I wanted to say it calmly, because the calm was the whole point. The calm was the thing they'd never been able to take from me. June the filly nosed at my sleeve through the rails. Juniper dozed in the next paddock over. I'd planned every word of the next day down to the breath. What I had not planned, what I genuinely did not see coming, was that my family would simply walk through the front gate uninvited, the way you do when you've spent your whole life believing a closed door doesn't apply to you. The day came up gold and still. By 11 the arena lot was full, trucks and trailers and the buyers' black SUVs lined along the fence, and close to 300 people drifted across the grounds with cups of coffee and lemonade, talking horses and weather and the unbelievable thing this widow had built out here in the dirt. There was a long table of food under the tent, and I'd asked Ruth to bring her stew, and she'd made it in that same chipped marigold dish, scaled up to a roaster but ladled, at the end, out of the original, because some things you don't replace just because you finally can. I wore a clean shirt and good boots, and I shook 100 hands. Vivian found me and squeezed my arm and said, "You did exactly what I knew you'd do," and I told her she was the only person who'd ever bet on me with her own money instead of her opinions. Walt and Ruth sat in the front row near the stage, Walt in a tie he clearly hated, Ruth with the twins on either side of her in their good clothes, Caleb fidgeting, Hannah solemn and proud. The buyer's lead came over to confirm we were set to make it official from the stage. Everything was calm. Everything was exactly as I'd built it. I stepped up toward the little wooden stage with my few pages of words I didn't really need, and I scanned the happy, sunlit crowd one last time, the faces of every person who'd had a hand in this. And that's when I saw them. My mother, my father, and Travis, walking in through the front gate, dressed for a photograph, working the edges of the crowd like they owned the day. Uninvited. Smiling. Right on time. They moved through my people like dignitaries. My mother had on the good coat and a smile she could hold for an hour without it cracking, and she stopped to introduce herself to strangers as Beth's mother. "You must be so impressed, we always knew." Travis had positioned himself near the small cluster of press, the regional magazine, and a live stream camera, and I watched him lean toward a reporter and say, just loud enough, that the family had sacrificed everything to give me my start. That this was a story about what a family can do when they stand together. My father trailed behind them, hands in his pockets, eyes finding mine, and then sliding away. They were not here to celebrate. They were here to be seen celebrating, to plant themselves in the frame so that whatever came next, every photograph and every clip would show them at my side, the loving family, owed. My mother caught my eye across the crowd and lifted her hand in a little wave, confident, proprietary, the wave of a woman certain her seat was being saved. A few of the neighbors who'd known the real story years ago went quiet and still, the way a herd goes quiet when something walks the fence line that doesn't belong. Ruth's hand found Hannah's shoulder. Vivian raised one eyebrow at me, a question. I gave the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. I climbed the 2 steps onto the stage and the crowd began to settle and turn toward me, and my mother smiled out at all of them like she'd built the place herself, already arranging her face for the gratitude she was sure was coming. I set my unneeded pages on the podium. I looked at the people I loved in the front row. And then, I began. I didn't raise my voice. That was the whole point, and I'd promised it to myself the night before on an overturned bucket. The louder a thing is, the easier it is to argue with. So I started soft, and the crowd leaned in to hear me, which meant by the time I got to the part that mattered, 300 people were dead silent, straining toward every word. I thanked them for coming. I told them the short version of the truth, that 8 years ago I'd arrived in Cedar Hollow with 2 babies and nothing, and that the people who'd taken me in hadn't asked what I could do for them. They'd just set 2 more plates. I found Ruth's eyes in the front row. Then I said I had 2 gifts to give before we made anything official, and I wanted to give them in front of everyone because the right people deserve to be thanked out loud. First, I said, the foundation. I nodded and the banner unrolled behind me, and there it was, the Daniel Sinclair Memorial Scholarship, my late husband's name 20 feet tall over my shoulder, funded to help young people into the work that saved my life, with a preference for parents raising children alone. The crowd made that warm, low sound a crowd makes when something lands. And then, the second gift. I asked Walt and Ruth to stand. They did. Confused. Ruth pressing her hand to her chest, and I told the 300 people what I'd told no one outside a lawyer's office. That the deed to this land was already, as of this week, signed back to Walt and Ruth Sinclair, free and clear, theirs forever, along with everything they'd need to never worry again, because 8 years ago they'd given a stranger a home, and you don't repay that. You can only try to match it. Ruth started to cry. Walt caught her elbow. The crowd rose to its feet, and the applause rolled across the grounds like weather. And in the front rim of that crowd, 3 faces did not move. My mother's smile was still fixed in place, but it had stopped meaning anything. Frozen on a face that was rapidly understanding it had brought the wrong expression to the wrong event. Travis had gone white. My father was staring at the stage like a man watching a train he'd assumed would stop. I let the applause settle. Then I looked right at them. Just the 3 of them, and I said the only thing left to say, quietly, so the whole silent crowd could hear every word. Family isn't who shares your blood, it's who showed up. My mother found her voice first, and it was not the warm one. It was the porch voice, 8 years older and twice as sharp, and it came out of her before she could stop it. "How dare you," she said, loud enough now that heads turned. "How dare you humiliate your family in front of all these people?" And there it was, the inversion I'd promised myself, the calm woman on the stage, and the loud one in the crowd, the exact reverse of a porch in October. Travis tried to rescue it, stepping forward, saying something about how this wasn't legal, that family had rights, that they'd contributed, words with no weight behind them because there were no documents behind them, only a story they'd told themselves. The buyer's lead quietly signaled 2 staff, who moved toward my family with the gentle, immovable politeness of people who do this for a living. My father didn't say anything at all. He just looked at me, and for one last second, the confession from the trailer lot flickered across his face. The thing he felt, and would never do. And then he looked at the ground, where he always looked, and let himself be guided toward the gate. My mother kept talking the whole way out, her voice getting smaller as the distance grew. "After everything I did for you, after everything," until the gate closed and the words stopped, and the grounds were just my people again, 300 witnesses, and a silence that finally belonged to me. The celebration went on, because that's what celebrations do, and within 20 minutes the strangeness had folded back into music and food and the ordinary joy of people who like each other. But I slipped away from the tent for a minute, because I needed to. I walked back toward the house and sat on the porch swing, and Ruth came and sat beside me without a word, and somebody had left the blue star quilt folded over the arm of the swing, soft and faded now, 8 years of washings thin in the cotton. Ruth pulled it across both our laps, out past the rail, Juniper grazed in the gold evening light, and beside her June the filly mirrored her down to the crooked leg. 2 ends of a line nobody had wanted to bet on, but me. Caleb and Hannah ran across the grass toward us, breathless about something, the way kids are, and they piled onto the swing and under the quilt. And for a moment there were 4 of us tangled up in a faded blanket that had wrapped these same 2 babies in a parking lot once, when we had nothing. We didn't have nothing anymore, but that was never really the point. You probably want to know what happened to them, so I'll tell you, briefly, because they don't get to be the long part of my story anymore. My family hired a lawyer. Of course they did. The letter arrived a few weeks later, full of words like reasonable expectation and family contribution, and Pat read it once, set it down, and said it had all the legal force of a wish. There was nothing to contest. The trust was irrevocable, the deed was recorded, the foundation was chartered. I hadn't built a scheme they could break. I'd built a structure they could only stand outside of, which is exactly what I'd intended on a Tuesday 2 years before with a printed email in my hand. The letters stopped. Travis's franchise finally closed for good, the consequence of his own choices and not $1 of mine, and I won't pretend a small, tired part of me didn't note the symmetry. My father sent one more message, months later. No apology in it, just a line that said, "Your mother won't ever forgive this," as if that were news, as if it were my loss. I didn't reply. Walt and Ruth still live in the farmhouse on the 80 acres that are theirs, and the funded account means Ruth finally let Walt fix his knee and take her to the coast for a week, the first vacation of their married life. The foundation gave out its first scholarship the following fall, and I want you to know who got it, because it's the part I'm proudest of. A 24-year-old widow with a toddler, working nights, who wanted to learn equine science and had been told by everyone in her life that it wasn't practical for a girl in her situation. I read her essay 3 times. I called Pat and told her to make sure that one went through. Because 8 years ago, a woman knocked on the wrong door with 2 babies and got told she was a bad investment. I just wanted to be the right door for somebody else. I kept a smaller place after the sale, 20 acres down the road from Walton Ruth, with a barn just big enough for what matters. I breed a handful of foals a year off June now, the filly with Juniper's leg, and I do it slow and careful, and for the love of it, not because a bank is counting. Juniper still grazes by the live oak where the kids can see her from the fence. Caleb wants to be a vet. Hannah wants to run the foundation someday, and I think she will. We eat dinner at a table with no empty seats and no hidden ledgers, and most nights it's nothing special, just stew and homework and a dog under the table, and that ordinary, unremarkable peace is the richest thing I own. It cost me $100 million to learn it was free all along. I spent the first half of my life believing I had to earn a seat at my own family's table, until 2 people I wasn't even born to simply set one for me, asked for nothing in return, and taught me the only lesson that ever stuck. Love that keeps a ledger was never love, it was just an invoice waiting to be sent. That's my story. One closed door, one open kitchen, and a crooked-legged horse nobody wanted but me. If somebody showed up for you when your own blood wouldn't, go tell them today. Don't wait for $100 million reason. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, tell me about the door that opened for you, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.